All right, folks, good morning. Welcome to AUSA and our fourth coffee series of the year, featuring General Jody Daniels, Commanding General of the U.S. Army Reserve Command. Thank you for being here today. My name is Alex Brody. I am the Director of Meetings for AUSA, and it's great to welcome you back in person to our events here at AUSA. We have a great group, as you can see, with us here today for our distinguished speaker. So thank you for joining us. I first want to thank our 4-star sponsor, Leonardo DRS, and 2-star sponsor, Northrop Grumman, for their support of this event. We cannot thank you enough for your support of AUSA. Please give Leonardo DRS and Northrop Grumman a big round of applause. If anyone else is interested in being a sponsor of our coffee series or any other AUSA events, please connect with Gay Hudson, our Deputy Director, and Emily Call, our Sponsorship Manager here at AUSA. They are out in the lobby and would be happy to meet with you after this event. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize distinguished guests who are here with us this morning. We appreciate the presence of General Officers and Command Sergeants Major joining us this morning as well. It's always great to have you here at AUSA. And I'd also like to acknowledge any congressional staff that are here. Your efforts on behalf of the Army, soldiers, and families is greatly appreciated. And with that, my 3 minutes of fame are up, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Vice President of Leadership and Education for the Association of the United States Army. Please put your hands together for General Les Smith.
Put your hands together. Thanks, Alex. Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm the new guy. Cool. We have a great group here today and a distinguished guest speaker. Today, our speaker is Jody J. Daniels. With over 39 years of active and reserve service, Lieutenant General Jody J. Daniels currently serves as the Chief of the Army Reserve and Commanding General of the U.S. Army Reserve Command. And she's also a doctor. So what should I call you, doctor or general? Which one? Whatever, just call you Jody. Okay, great. Jody leads a community-based force of more than 200,000 soldiers and civilians with a footprint that encompasses all 50 states and 5 territories and more than 23 countries across the globe. Her principal military roles have been in intelligence, civil affairs, and training while serving in the U.S., Korea, Kosovo, Iraq, and Germany. She has commanded at all levels and served on a number of strategic advisory boards. In her civilian career, Dr. Daniels was previously the Director of Advanced Programs for Lockheed Martin's Advanced Technology Research Laboratories. Prior to that, she was Director in Army Research Laboratory, where she led 30 engineers, which means she is really, really smart, in 2 software technology areas. She holds a Bachelor's of Science. It says BS, but I said Bachelor's of Science. I'm just reading what it says right here. We were hallmates, so I used to walk by and eat all their candy, and the Chief of Army Reserve Office. That's another story. From Carnegie Mellon University, a Master's of Science and a PhD in Computer Science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. You know how you and I graduated? Thank you, Lordy. She graduated, yeah, I know. And an MS in Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. Before we welcome Lieutenant General Daniels, please direct your attention to the screen for a brief video.
Today's Army Reserve covers more than 20 time zones across 5 continents. Our people are the most important weapon system in accomplishing the mission. Now, more than ever, America needs a powerful and resilient force ready to deliver vital capabilities around the world and here at home. In an ever-changing landscape of both visible and invisible threats, we stand ready to defeat our enemies anytime, anywhere. America's Army Reserve is ready now, shaping tomorrow.
Please join me in a good round of applause for Lieutenant General Jody Daniels.
Wow. Oh, good morning. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. You can come by for candy anytime. Okay. Once you're allowed back in the building. Yeah. So greetings to all, fellow general officers, retired general officers, warrant officers, enlisted folks, civilians, industry partners, our friends and allies. It's great to see everybody here this morning. Actually, it's not. Anyone that knows me knows that this is not my time of day. Anyone that knows me knows that morning is really not my forte. I do not do coffee either. I do chocolate milk, and I have had my chocolate milk, so we should be okay. So if you saw in the video, I want to give a little bit of a background on sort of what we are now, and then where we think we're headed into the future. So if you looked at the video, how much combat arms did you see? Not a lot. You saw people firing their weapon systems because, in fact, that's what we do as soldiers. But the Army Reserve only has 1 battalion of infantry. The rest is enablers. So what you saw in the video is those capabilities that we bring to the battlefield that support the combat arms and keep them moving forward. And so we have a tremendous force that, across the country, across the globe, that continues to do those support missions. And I want to sort of, we talked about that 189, our end strength currently is authorization is 189,500, but those 11,000 civilians out in probably 1,100 plus different, or 11,000 plus, no wait, try that again, add more zeros, 110,000 different communities, because we're all over the place. We are all over the United States. And so, of course, we have our families that support us, and that's really important as well. We have employers. So that is something that we worry about all the time, which is making sure that we have that good rapport with our employers and making sure that we're doing those things that keep our employers in as a part of the community that helps support us. Because when we go and depart from them for a little while, they need to be welcoming us back into the formations. So I want to build a little bit on who we are before I talk about going forward. So the Army Reserve is incredibly diverse. We're also a little bit, we have a couple of degrees too. 33% of all Army Reserve soldiers have a bachelor's degree or higher. I don't need that. 10% of our officers have masters and 5% have doctorates. In our enlisted ranks, we've got more than 13% with bachelors and over 4% have a master's or a doctorate. So we're pretty well darn educated, and we continue to do that. I mean, we've blown through the tuition assistance funds like nobody's business the last few years. So we continue to really, so that means we have an interest in learning and an interest in growing, and we are inquisitive in what we do. So it's a really great learning force. We're also a very diverse set of folks in terms of all the different skills that we bring. So you saw some of them up there, but out in industry, we've got folks, doctors, lawyers, people are familiar with that, academics, scientists, engineers, cyber specialists, first responders, transportation, administrators, investment banking, business managers, and all the different technologies. And we use that in some of our force that I'll describe in the future. We also, as I mentioned, are quite diverse. So over 25% of the force, reserve force, is female, and over 25% are Blacks, Hispanics, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. 22% of the general officers are female. So that's a pretty good representation of the United States as well. Where have we coming from? COVID, everyone loves COVID. Not so much. So what did that do to the force? We were doing pretty good. We were good after training, continuing to support missions overseas. And then COVID struck, and we all went into sort of whole defilade, started doing remote battle assemblies, did that telework kind of thing. And we really got away from what I'm now forcing us to go back to: tough, realistic training done safely, getting back at it, getting back out into the field, getting back to training management, maintenance management, training, just training. Let's go do something cool and interesting, because we kind of have what I call a COVID hangover, where people were kind of comfortable in their slippers in the morning and half a uniform. And that's not where we need to be. You can't telework a war. You can't telework maintenance. There's some maintenance manuals you can get remotely. You can't, and you can do some telemedicine in terms of diagnostics, but actually the fixing, the doing, Doesn't happen unless you're there and in person. But we're still having a little bit of that challenge right now. But meanwhile, throughout the entire COVID period, not only did the Army Reserve support response to the nation, but we also supported every CTC rotation and most warfighters. So people don't realize that every time there's a CTC, I've got somebody out there doing something. Primarily it's civil affairs. We've also got transportation. We've got various different logistics capabilities. We've got medical folks out. We've got psychological operations out. We've got lots of other transporters, all kinds of different skills that folks will bring out depending on what's happening during a particular rotation. And so we haven't missed a beat. We also haven't missed a beat when it goes to deploying overseas. Right now, we probably have over 10,000 soldiers in 20 some odd countries, plus 3,000 or 4,000 here in the States that help do the mobilization and some of the other efforts here. So we have continued all of that through COVID. But that COVID hangover has caused a little bit of a challenge to us. And so what I have found is that the Army Reserve had gone into sort of a love of metrics. It's really easy to do metrics. Unfortunately, we do way too many of them. And then people call that readiness. Well, look, that's what's green, what's red, and they get after all the red stuff. But that's really not what's important to me. To me is that tough, realistic training done safely. So how are we getting after that? How are we making that happen? So I threw out a paper earlier this year called Changing Culture, Moving from Metrics to Readiness. And I challenged all of my commanders to get after it, and their command sergeants major. And I made them all read the paper, and we talked about it. During the yearly training brief, we didn't talk any metrics. We talked training for the next 5 years. What are we going to be doing? What are the friction points with modernization? How are we going to get after this? How are we going to keep everybody engaged in meaningful, exciting, interesting, relevant training? Because I think that will help us with our recruiting. When the soldiers go back to work or to school on Monday, hey, what did you do this weekend? And they have something to talk about, something interesting, something that's unique and different from what most other folks out there do. Although it may be some of the same skills. Our medical providers frequently hone their skills. They go deeper. They're very technically advanced. What they do in their civilian career, they also do for us in the reserve. But then there's a group of folks who do something vastly different because they want to broaden themselves. They want to advance and grow in a different dimension. So we have what I call the deepening crowd and the broadening crowd. We need to have both those have good, interesting experiences other than the bored crowd. We don't want them to be bored. We want them to be engaged doing things and advancing. So we're pushing hard on that. And I think that will help us in terms of as we come out of this COVID fog, as we try and get folks motivated and interested in what we're doing, what we represent. So we also started a recruiting and retention campaign last year, so ahead of the crisis, because I recognize we have a mid-grade shortage, and the Army Reserve needs to retain more folks. So I've challenged all of my folks to go after retention goals. I think that's one place where I didn't give anyone particular statistics that they had to achieve, but we are having a contest seeing who comes in first. So I sent out, but I didn't give objectives down to the company level. Because that was not my point. My point was bring in more folks, go and welcome people, onboard them, bring them in, make them a part of your team, grow the team. This is my squad. Let's really embrace that mentality. We published an op order. Oh, and so that recruiting and retention campaign briefs me every month on what we're doing. What are we doing to break down the bureaucratic barriers to recruiting and retention? How are we getting after that? We published an order back in April, Operation Shaping Tomorrow, which was, again, getting after recruiting, retention, and training. And then the point of that paper was the top cover. I don't care about your metrics. I care about your improvement in training. What are you doing to improve your unit? And it wasn't really getting out to everyone. We'd sent it out to some of the battalion and brigade commanders. And we were talking to the pre-command courses at the company level and at the battalion brigade level. There's still an information flow gap. So I emailed it to every single lieutenant colonel and colonel out in there in the Army Reserve. Figured, okay, I'm skipping echelons. I'm going to go out there and get the word out. So this is my top cover. I care about readiness. I care about training. Admin stuff will follow. It's not something you want to drop completely, but it's got too much primacy. We need to push it aside and do more training. So that's really the focus. We're working on a marketing campaign as well. But more importantly, one place that I'd ask you all to help out is how many people talk about getting out when they leave service? Most everyone talks about getting out, but aren't we soldiers for life? Therefore, talk about transition. please use transition instead of getting out. Because that then means that you may be transitioning to retirement, you may be transitioning to the Guard, you may be transitioning to be a student, but you may transition to the Army Reserve. But if we don't even talk about it that way, then we're missing out on that opportunity to at least plant the seed for, a couple of years later, you're like, man, I really missed being around soldiers and doing all those things that we were doing. So I'm asking folks to take on a slightly different vernacular and actually talk about transition. So I think that's kind of important. So then as we don't transition, we get people coming to us from the reserve, and that's actually, it's working. The active component, some folks have taken that on, and we're starting to see a little bit more flow between the AC and the RC. The Air Force is a 60% pull into their reserve component. That's pretty impressive. That's our stretch goal. If we could get there, and they were complaining when they were down to 50. I'm like, man, if we could only get up to 50, how great would that be? So that's where we are now. But where are we headed? Well, that's a really great question. We know we're headed to multi-domain operations. We know that's what we're targeting. We know that the Army has its 31+4. We know that there's these different types of priority units and capabilities that the Army wants to build as we look to 2030, 2040. But what does the reserve look like? And again, that's a great question. So I asked for your help because we don't know yet. The active component has gone through a night court equivalent to looking at all of its formations and is making adjustments to the total Army analysis for 25, 29 and deciding which units are the most important and sort of rank ordering them. And we will do that starting this fall with the Army Reserve and the Guard. Sort of what does the total force need to look like? And so as we look to adapt our structure, we look to build capabilities. What should those capabilities be? How does the Army Reserve contribute to this fight? And make sure that we're on that sustainable strategic path that the Secretary talks about. So a couple of things make sense for the Army Reserve. Those skills that are difficult and or are costly to retain and recruit. Nurses, doctors, lawyers. But interestingly enough, even some of our lawyers serve in different skills in the reserve because they want to go do something different. But the medical folks, I've run into some folks out at Global Medic last year. They're working in the lab, and I'm like, so what? What's your civilian career? I'm working on a master's in IT. Of course you are, but you're in here. It's like, you talk to these folks, and the other one was working on a bachelor's in cybersecurity, and you're here in the lab, and like, yeah, this is great. I love doing this. Like, okay, all right. And I met this really, I'm going to get the story a little bit wrong. This really great lieutenant. When I went down to visit African Lion down in Morocco, he was born in Nigeria. He came to the States. He was working on he'd gotten his bachelor's degree in something like biology on a scholarship somewhere in the Midwest. And then he'd enlisted, and then he went and got his master's degree in South Carolina in something completely different. And civilian job was one thing, and he had just gone to BOLIC because he'd become an officer for the Signal Corps. And you're just like, I can't keep track. But he was working on a movement control team down in Morocco. And you're like, of course. But these are the kind of skills that we have that we can use, that he knows how to do lots of different things. And we see this amongst our folks. So how do we tap into that on the active duty side of this talent base that has all these different great skill sets that you may not find on active duty? In particular, you're probably not going to find a lot of the civil affairs capabilities, psychological operations. We have a lot of cyber folks. We have, these private sector skills that we leverage. So we can continue to pull on those capabilities and use them because these folks are really talented in it. So maybe we should take a look at things like counter UAS. Look at what do the gaming skills sort of translate to. We also have the 75th Innovation Command. I sort of alluded to them early on. This is a whole group of folks who have technology backgrounds, synthetic biology, molecular engineering, IT, machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchaining, all kinds of different skill sets. They know how to do networking like nobody's business. So they have helped out with Project Convergence because it's something that, you want to tinker, that's the ultimate tinkerer's heaven. How do we bring all these different skills together, different capabilities together in the Army that haven't been able to talk to each other and make the timeline much shorter? How do we shrink them? So my team has been out there. Marty Klein, his group, he's got lots of really talented individuals that have been called in to help out, and they go out to the desert and they have a grand time. But we've got more of those in the force. He also got called in when the 18th Airborne Corps went over to the Ukraine, because we also have data scientists and the ability to capture that data and leverage that data. And so they went in for a couple of weeks, helped out, did some troubleshooting, did some expert advising, and then they came back to their civilian careers. So maybe there's something to be had there on that front. Is it information advantage? Is it a protection organization? Is it more cyber? What kinds of skills and capabilities are these? Break. The other piece that we need to take a look at is theater logistics, which, by the way, according to the joint publication, also includes engineering and medical skill sets. So when you think logistics, it's not just about transportation, it's a lot broader than that. So there's a lot of capabilities in there that the NDS, National Defense Strategy, says that we, the Army, should be looking at. Army Reserve seems to have the bulk of that capability. I have more than 50% of the Army's medical capabilities are in the Army Reserve. So, and then I've got 2 theater engineering commands. And we've got lots of, 2 theater sustainment commands. And one of them is the largest organization, I swear, in any Army. It's like 33,000 at the 2-star level. It's pretty big. Okay, it's just a small job. And that's a part-time job. That's not a full-time job, that's a part-time job. Keep that in mind. So this is one of our challenges. So we have these great capabilities. And so how are we going to use, what does theater logistics look like in the future? Look at Ukraine to give you some examples. And how do we need to be ready for that kind of a scenario? And how do we modernize ourselves and the Army Reserve and the Guard and the active component to deal with those kinds of quests? So that's something we're going to take a hard look at as we go forward. And then the final is sort of, defense of the homeland. The Army Reserve has quite a bit of suburban capability. We've got a lot of folks who work in the civilian sector, that work in energy, work in cyber, all those different kinds of skills that you're going to want for homeland defense, infrastructure protection, as well as potentially maybe things that go boom, besides stopping things that go boom with this, with the EOD sorts. So we're taking a look at what should that be. We're going to start looking at the 2630 Total Army Analysis, TAA 2630. So we're starting the conversations now as we lead into the October discussions. Maybe there's some other capabilities that are a little bit more combat arms-ish, or maybe even combat arms itself. Lightweight, not large BCT kind of organizations. We don't have the infrastructure to support that. And it doesn't really make sense to try and bring on the mechanics and that would be required for that kind of a capability. We don't have large BCT type installations, but maybe something on the reconnaissance side would be appropriate, where we could break up units, battalion and below, that would be able to go to our various different training areas. So I throw these out really as food for thought, because I don't know what the answers are. We, the Army, don't know what the answers are, but we're looking to sort of shape that future, to shape tomorrow. To look at where can we provide maximal value, where we can bring the civilian force, the dual citizen force to bear as we go forward. Okay, so I think that's, okay, final point. Call to action. You got to have a call to action. And this will be no surprise to anyone. I've already given one, which is to please transition from, to talk about transition rather than getting out. The second one is, no matter what you want the Army of 2030, 2040 to look like, we need your help in recruiting to make sure that we have an all-volunteer force. You've probably heard out in the news, there's little challenges with recruiting these days. We're a little light, not exactly where we'd like to be. And we need everyone's help in talking to and encouraging, inspiring folks to come and serve. Whether it's telling your story, telling your war stories from when you did serve, or even just encouraging more folks to come, influencing those who are of an era that could start. We do age waivers. So please, and because we're looking at the talent, and so related but different, we actually have broken the code. Finally, it was a little challenging on direct commissioning. We don't have a whole lot that we broke the code on, but we did break it this year. We'd had a number of folks who wanted to join our ranks from civil affairs communities, people with masters, PhDs, with 10, 15 years of great deep expertise in the area, in civil affairs, different areas. And we've now brought in 14, and we've got more. Initially I was told, no, you don't have a mission. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna break mission. I'm gonna exceed mission. Who doesn't want to exceed mission, right? If you got a goal of 0, I can certainly help exceed that. So we broke the code. We've gotten some folks in, and they're talented individuals, but we also, we can do things quick. I had the opportunity last year to commission an astronaut, and so we can do those quickly too. But how do we make it easier for folks to join us? And that's something we're going after. So my call to you is, please help us, active, Guard, Reserve, bring talent into the force, so that we can do that shaping of tomorrow. So with that, I'll stop here, and I will take any questions that you all may happen to have. Thank you.
General, thank you for your briefing and comments. Very, very interesting. And my name is Eric Kelly. I'm the military attaché at the Norwegian Embassy. Is the Army Reserve engaged in any international programs similar to like the Guards State Partnership Program, etc.? And could you maybe say something about it?
So we do not have a state partnership program like the Guard. However, you will find us supporting operations around the world. But we do have a military exchange program, the MPEP. And in fact, I was just talking to my counterpart in the UK last week about where we are on that front, talking with some of the Canadians as well as to how do we reinvigorate that. COVID kind of put a dampened all of that exchange activity, but we're looking to reinvigorate it. And we do have spaces, and we do have soldiers that would like to go do AT, their annual training in support of various different events. So we're reinvigorating that program. So we can certainly talk more about how we make sure that your folks are involved, and how we get involved in working, cooperating with you all, doing those exchanges, because they're great events. And so slightly different, related. So I went over this a couple, 3 weeks back to Romania, to Resolute Castle, which is where our engineers are helping do construction projects in support of their NTC equivalent, if you will. So they were laying roads. I learned all about cells and how you lay foundations, and they were putting out forms and throwing down a lot of concrete. Miles and miles of roads are being laid there, so helping out on that front. And then I also went down to Morocco, as I mentioned, to African Lion, and we had a lot of our theater logistics capabilities there, including the medical and some of our transportation and other capabilities involved in that exercise. So we do like to go out and support all the different exercises, and there's a lot more going on across the globe that we do participate in. Thank you.
Morning, ma'am. Dan Bish, Army National Guard. From your perspective, ma'am, you talked theater logistics and you talked Dom Ops. What are some of the things from your perspective from the Army Reserve, collaborative ideas with the Guard? Anything that you're working on right now that we can kind of work together on, things you need our help with, things that... Recruiting. Right. Thank you.
So in fact, General Jensen and I have signed a memorandum of understanding that we will not do incentive fratricide. So we will collaboratively look at what incentives we give to folks, so that we're not trying to poach off of each other. We're mutually supporting at those transition points across all the different installations to make sure that we support each other. Whenever there's a briefing, for example, we have another one this afternoon. Our teams get together and talk. What are you showing? What are we showing? What can I abscond with, from yours? So we integrate, so we go together with a unified message. So the good news was, interestingly enough, he and I both came here from a recent assignment in Minnesota. So we had known each other before we ever got here. And so we have been working quite collaboratively to try and not hurt each other, but help each other to continue to get the force. So, I don't know if I mentioned the Guard multiple times when I talk about transition, because it's the family. If I believe in soldier in life, then I believe in the family. And I'm not just going to go and sell the Army Reserve. I did active duty time. My husband was enlisted in the National Guard simultaneous membership program before he went on active duty. So we're a multi-compo family.
Yes, good morning, ma'am. Mr. Harris with the Merck. I did have a pre-position question before coming here, but your brief today made me come up with another one. So
You can ask your
I have
question.
two.
I'm ready to handle it. I can take anything. Go ahead, hit me.
Okay, so the first one was the capabilities that you talk about that the soldiers in the Army Reserve bring, and
Yeah.
as you mentioned, diverse
Yeah.
and more than a ORB would present. So, are there any strategies that you have that we could capture that capabilities, talents that the soldiers have, and be able to leverage those by knowing that the the soldiers self-identifying that they have those
Sure.
capabilities. And the other,
So let me do one. We'll come back to
Okay,
okay. So that's everyone asks that. You got this great talent out. Okay, here's the problem. By law, we cannot bring someone on an active duty order involuntarily based on their civilian skill sets. They must volunteer to work in that civilian skill set. We'd love to know what they are, to ask them, hey, we have this opportunity. Wouldn't you love to go do this? But we can't mandatorily use that skill set unless they happen to be in a position that uses that skill set. So we want the information. We'd love to have the information. We were just talking about this last week. I was up at Annapolis with the Naval Reserve and rep from the Air Reserve and the UK. There was a Commodore who was there present talking about this as well. They have much more open rules. They can bring in anybody for all different kinds of reasons. By law, we cannot. So yes, we'd love to know more. We'd love to be able to tap into that database and ask them. There have been a number of initiatives to try and build that database. The 75th Innovation did one. Unfortunately, their garage work was a little 1970s, and I kind of put an end to it because it was so not 2000s technology. But there's a DARPA program that's looking at it. And there's a cyber piece that's also looking at how do we capture certificates that someone has accumulated, skills that they have acquired in the civilian sector. So how do we leverage that information legally? So that is something that we are looking at, but we have to be very careful how we collect it and what we do with it. And it has to be voluntary.
yes, ma'am. Okay. And the other question was the active component. As you know, the Secretary of Army put out a memorandum stating that they have recruiting challenges and meeting end strength, and was going to rely more on the Army Reserve. So I wanted to know what additional pressures would that put on the Army Reserve, as we're already challenged with recruiting as well.
So what the challenge becomes whether or not the reserve components are needed for additional active missions and more mobilizations are necessary. And that becomes a challenge. So the question is, we have to make sure that what the combatant commands request can be satisfied with the capabilities, including dwell times for all the active and the reserve formations. So that's something that we're constantly monitoring to see where we stand. Thus far, the Army Reserve has been sort of, last 5 years have been rather steady state, with the exceptions of the COVID response and with the exceptions of Operation Allies Welcome, which were unplanned, not known, emergent missions that pop up, you're gonna go do it. We do, and then the Ukraine. So the president has not given authorities for mobilization of the reserve for Ukraine. So we can support on annual training, we can support on ADOS, we can support, but we're not mobilizing any units. Interestingly enough, we do have a unit on PTDO, Prepared to Deploy order, and that's a unique status to be in if you're in the reserve, because what does that really mean? We haven't quite figured that out yet. So we're still kind of fleshing our way through what does it mean to be prepared to deploy? Deploy when, how soon, and what. So we've got some folks we brought on orders so they can make sure that unit is ready to go if an order does come through on a short notice that they are going to actually deploy. But we have to be very judicious in how we put someone on a PTDO because the immediate thing is, we need to bring a few more people on orders to make sure that we've got everything just so that we do hit that time window, whatever it is. If it's a PTDO for 120 days, okay, that's easy. If it's for 30 days, that's a different story because we can do a lot in more time, obviously. So we're looking at that very carefully, but we have not yet seen any pressure on us. All we've seen a pressure on is bring more people in, go get more people, quality people, make sure they're quality people, go get more. That's the only pressure we're seeing.
Good morning, ma'am. So I'm First Class Doll Cutter, 94th Training Division. My question is, has USART considered incentivizing officers and NCOs for KD positions by offering ADOS tours or extra duty pay to account for the demands of these positions? An example would be command team or key staff incentivizing the best of the Army Reserves to take positions, requirements versus money and time to accomplishment, shortfalls.
Sure. Have we considered it? Have we considered being able to bring folks on longer tours? Absolutely. On the flip side, what I say, but the first challenge is we then become no longer a reserve force if you're working in a full-time status. And that's kind of the friction point. How much full-time is an appropriate amount of full-time? Which, especially when you have an employer and you're trying to maintain two career paths simultaneously. The second piece to that is we just don't have that kind of money. But then so what are our alternate solutions besides bringing people on? Well, what are the freaking requirements? What are we making them do? What activities are they doing that they shouldn't be doing? And what activities should we just take away from them because it doesn't make a lot of sense? So I actually put out a memo, CG sends, that says, if you're a command head, if you're in a particular echelon and you have access to a database that has all the answers that you need, don't task your lower echelons to give you that information. You can ask them to validate that what you've got is correct and that their system, whatever they put into the system makes sense, but don't task the subordinates to do something that you can do yourself. I'm working on a paper that describes all of the requirements that we have placed on company commanders in their first 120 days of duty. And it is a lot. If you're a reserve service member, you have about 4 weeks plus worth of work just to get started by AR 600-20, 600-9, and all of the other regulations that are out there, all the different things that you must do, your inventories, your class work that you're supposed to go to, the safety course, the EO course, the meetings that you have to have, the counselings you need to do, the command policies that you're supposed to publish, your command philosophy. And for a company commander, it's a lot of work. So how do I, where do we want to take risk on company commanders and give them, so they're pencil whipping stuff, they're reusing someone else's policy and changing their name and the date, but they're not actually absorbing and understanding why that policy exists and what it means. And it's the same thing with some of these courses. Are they redundant? Can we get rid of some of them? Because if you look at that set of requirements, it's crazy. And even if you're on active duty, it's going to take you that long. But if you're a reservist, it's even that much harder. So how do we help them? And then that should translate on up the chain in terms of reducing requirements. I've stopped any phone calls that have anything to do with medical readiness calls to PHA completion dates. Because it takes time and effort and energy away from tough, realistic training done safely. That's what we need to be focusing on. And so that's what I'm trying to provide. That's why I wrote the paper to write. Let's get back to training. Let's get away from all this admin stuff, administrivia, if you will, in some cases. Let's actually focus on what we should be doing. And I think the admin will fill in. Hip pocket training. How many people actually do hip pocket training, even know what it is anymore? We're so conditioned to, it's got to be a PowerPoint, it's got to be in a room, it's got to be someone sitting there, and you got to sign in. No, you can do it freaking under a tree and it'll take you 15 minutes as opposed to an hour of PowerPoint where people are poking their eyeballs out. I mean, seriously, how many of you have lived this dream? So how do we change that? How do we change the culture? Get back to hip pocket, cover the mandatory stuff, but don't do it in the same boring, repetitive way, but actually have a conversation where we discuss the topic and interact on the topic. And then you get a lot more out of it than just, okay, I was there, here's my CAC, here's my signature. We need to change what we're doing. And I think if we get away from a lot of what we have been doing because it was easy, here's the set of slides everyone uses, as opposed to, hey, let's talk about, then I think we'll make a lot more progress and we'll get towards a much more engaged force, and we'll have that capability for those commanders and those key positions to not be so insanely busy and to actually be at a more, I'm not even gonna call it balance. So here's another pet peeve. I've given up on work-life balance. There's no such thing as freaking work-life balance. They're not even. Okay, you've got an employer, you've got family, you've got kids' sports, you've got your own hobbies, you've got, downtime maybe. It's not balance. I call it integration. And how do you prioritize your time? So we need to do a better job prioritizing so people know where things fit. How does it mesh together? And it's not because it ain't balance. So I know I've answered your question in a really long roundabout way, but this is sort of the philosophy that I'm trying to make sure that my leaders have as well. And a lot of the GOs and the command sergeants major are all in and trying to reduce some of that admin burden to free up time to do what is important, what is at the top of the priority chain, to give people that time off to go be with their families, to give that predictability to their employers. So great question.
Morning, ma'am. Steph Sangoro, and I would say a great presentation. So you mentioned about recruiting and the transition for active duty to reserves, and I know we're starting a pilot where we're trying to fill active reserve command billets with active duty soldiers. So I know that it's going to be difficult because the Marine Corps, where they're able to have a command staff and full-time support staff that are active duty soldiers that work side by side with reserve soldiers and train them. However, has there been any talk about the enlisted corps and talks about having active duty soldiers work with the enlisted side of the house, ma'am?
So the pilot is, in fact, a total of 4 spaces that have been historically very hard to fill and have gone unfilled. And so we talked to the Talent Management Task Force, and they actually said, would you be interested in doing a pilot where we put an active duty person into some spaces? So we looked very carefully at what did we do and who we brought, not who we brought in, they were board selected, but what positions we did have available to make sure that now that unit at least has a leader. I know there's been some concern about from the AGR force, why didn't I get that opportunity? Because we do already have AGR billets, and we didn't have enough folks that necessarily even applied for in some cases, and there may not be a skills match. So there were lots of reasons, and we can't necessarily bring on full-time folks, bring on TPUs to do these positions full-time. We don't have the raw money. Our budget is constrained in that way. But have we looked at being able to then bring over enlisted folks? So we do work multi-compo organizations. So we've got some active, we've got some guard, we've got some reserve, all in the same organization. We look at those very carefully in terms of who can do what, and we've got a number of units that are multi-compo. We've got that one. So the first one that comes to mind is there's an intelligence brigade out in Texas that is primarily reserve, but it's got I want to say 15 to 20 personnel who are active duty. And we have other organizations like that, the 377th Headquarters, Theater Security Cooperation, Theater Sustainment Command, there we go. They have an active duty set, and it's got all different ranks and grades. So we do have units that are a mixture of officer, enlisted, warrant in those organizations already. Are we looking to expand that? That really is something that we decide with the active duty folks as to where they would like to have that mix, where it makes sense for an organization to be whichever compo primacy makes sense. So we're always relooking those organizations.
Ma'am, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your support of AUSA. Please give General Daniels a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks to my good friend Jody for that great discussion. Now, before we go, I want to inform you of a few key events. First, we're recruiting for your AUSA. If you're not a member, please sign up before you leave. We have a special deal for you today. I'm not going to tell you what it is. Just sign up on your way out. Don't miss out on our August noon reports. Degrade and Destroy, the inside story of the war against the Islamic State, streaming on Tuesday, August the 9th, and Countering Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems with Major General Sean Gainey, streaming on August 23rd. So we're listening to you. Our next Hot Topic series will focus on Army aviation here on August 25th. And if you haven't already marked your calendars, get ready for our annual meeting, 10 through 12 October at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center. For information about these events, please visit our website or see our team outside. Finally, we want to thank all of you who support us, who support our membership. Our membership matters and support our soldiers and their families. Thank you again for attending and have a great Army Day. Hua.